Hayden Lake, Idaho, 100 miles from the Canadian border and almost 200 feet deep in the center of the lake. A 4,000-acre lake with 40 miles of beautiful shoreline. 118 billion gallons of precious water. We love Hayden Lake, and Hayden Lake is in trouble, deep trouble.
Is Hayden Lake really in deep trouble? Who has the facts? Not emotions, not politics. Facts. Scientists would be the safest bet. Trouble is, compared to most people, scientists are quiet types. They're thinkers, not talkers, unless someone asks them for their input. And even then, they're easily drowned out by folks who are more comfortable speaking out without benefit of the facts. So, let's ask some scientists about Hayden Lake in particular, and watersheds in general, and let's give them the microphone. But first, is Hayden Lake worth worrying about? I ask the question because some have said Hayden Lake isn't as important to the local economy, or as popular, or as infamously polluted as her big sister Lake Coeur d'Alene. And so, they say, we shouldn't be wasting our money and our efforts worrying about what is affectionately referred to as the duck pond. Because Hayden Lake used to be part of the Coeur d'Alene tribe's native lands, I asked tribal elder and historian Felix Aripa for information nobody else would have about the value of the lake to the tribe long before white people appeared on the scene.
There are different places around the lake where they have winter quarters. They'll choose a place, I don't know, somewhere around the lake where they can be protected against the north wind. And they can fish here year round. They call it estumish. That's a cutthroat.
The trout fishery is still a highly valued, officially recognized and protected benefit for which Hayden Lake is well known. The West Slope cutthroat trout, which is native to Hayden Lake and a significant contributor to the local economy, is also the official state fish of Idaho. Another of Hayden Lake's official and protected benefits is its value for recreation. Secondary recreation, as in activities on or beside the water that don't necessarily get you wet, and primary recreation, as in you are likely, either on purpose or inadvertently, to take water in your mouth, up your nose, and so forth. Hayden Lake is also where more than 1 million people and counting turn for clean, pure, healthy water. Lakeshore property owners who get their water directly from the lake, and the 1 million-plus folks whose water comes entirely from the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer. And, by the way, the aquifer is why the Coeur d'Alene tribe called Hayden Lake Hntakan.
Hntakan, that's the original in the name. Hntakan means it might be a place where you're taken in, you know. That's in relation to that whirlpool.
If you've heard those stories about the whirlpools, you should know that they're not just a fairy tale. And there's a perfectly logical explanation why whirlpools existed in Hayden Lake and may actually still appear unexpectedly from time to time. It has to do with how the lake formed in the first place.
There was an ice dam in the vicinity of Clark Fork that was about 2,000 feet high. And that failed suddenly, and the speculation is that it didn't fail from being overtopped. It actually failed from water seeping out underneath. So when it failed, it was as sudden a failure as you can possibly imagine. I believe, if I remember correctly, the estimates were that water over the present city of Spokane was flowing at about 200 feet deep. So it would have been an incredibly impressive thing to see from a high point.
Imagine boulders as big as cabins thundering over the landscape at about 80 miles an hour. When the water hit the prairie, it slowed down just enough for the heaviest boulders to tumble out, creating the floor of what is now Hayden Lake. The lighter stuff, the topsoil and so forth, kept going. As you can imagine, that rocky floor leaked, making whirlpools. The cracks gradually spackled in with silt, but as history and legend suggest, sometimes those seals broke loose.
And there were stories about this lake. They said there's always been a kind of a whirlpool that appears. Sometimes they'll throw something in there and it'll take it down. And here it says the whirlpool at the south end of the lake. The Indians threw a tippy poles which disappeared. Once an unwary Indian in a canoe was pulled down to the underground passage. He walked underground for 3 days until he saw a dim light and came to the waterfall. Beyond the waterfall, he saw life and happiness. He plunged through the falls and was pulled underwater. When he bobbed to the surface, he saw the shore and trees. He swam until finally, lying exhausted on the shore, he found himself at Camila, and that's Post Falls. And that color tells the story about the aquifer.
So the Indians knew, without any doubt, long before white people did, about the strong connection between Hayden Lake and the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer, especially here, at the south end of the lake, near Honeysuckle Beach, where scientists now believe the bulk of the lake's leakage into the aquifer occurs, both through the bottom of the lake and through the porous ground across the dike. That leakage, which made itself known in legendary whirlpools, still happens today in a less dramatic way. And that leakage is critical for quenching the thirst of people in northern Idaho and eastern Washington, because, like any aquifer, what you take out, to drink or take a shower or water your yard, has to be replaced, recharged. The modern belief was that most of the aquifer's recharge came from Lake Pend Oreille, with Lake Coeur d'Alene and the Spokane River coming in second. With Hayden Lake's contribution, not even on the radar.
Our understanding of that has changed dramatically. Recharge from the lakes surrounding the aquifer. Hayden Lake has the highest estimated contribution on an average basis. So the contribution of Hayden Lake Hayden Lake drainage is something that's very important as far as the aquifer is concerned.
So in addition to the emotional connection quite a few of us have with Hayden Lake, especially for those folks fortunate enough to own or have access to lakefront property, its value goes way beyond aesthetics and fun. Sounds like it's all good. So what was the talk about Hayden Lake being in deep trouble?
It takes a lot of pollution to take over a lake like ours, but that's what's happening to Hayden Lake.
Idaho Department of Environmental Quality says that Hayden Lake's water quality is threatened. It is threatened due to excess amounts of nutrients caused by human-related activities.
When I first was acquainted with Hayden Lake and began visiting here and working here in the early to mid-60s, this was an oligotrophic lake, which means it was very low in nutrients, very clear, very clean. Now it is mesotrophic, with many of the bays eutrophic, which means that it's a high amount of nutrients and high amount of algal growth.
State agencies, pushed by the federal government, have found that Hayden Lake's water quality is going downhill at a rate is 29% above the acceptable level.
Oh yes, it's changed greatly. I think more because of the population around the backside of the lake.
Hayden Lake is formed in a bowl with steep, rugged mountains around it that are made up of very erosive soils. The geology is very fragile and easily transported when the vegetation is removed.
Hayden Lake is kind of unique. It's fragile in the sense that because it doesn't have water flowing through it, pollution that occurs within the drainage tends to be trapped.
The nutrients that are here from 30, 40 years ago are still being recycled in this lake.
I look at aerial photos photos. I have them from 1937, and I look at them today, and there's a big difference in the bays.
In the mid-60s, the lake came clear up to the bridge on the north end of the lake where the road crosses Hayden Creek. Now, the lake shore is several hundred feet further down into the lake. This is all filled up with sediment that has come out of Hayden Creek, and basically as a result of logging and road building and disruption of the natural hydrologic processes in Hayden Creek.
Huge amounts of weeds now are showing up in the bay due to increased phosphorus that's going into the lake from development that occurs around the lake.
Do you see the brown plumes of sediment pouring into the water during the spring thaw? Every year now, this runoff gets worse and worse. That's because the vegetation on the sides of the lake's bowl is constantly getting disturbed. And because Hayden Lake has no river outlet, the phosphorus carried in that runoff not only doesn't get carried out, it actually gets stronger over time, because pure water evaporates off in the summer, and then more polluted water pours in the following spring, and then more pure water evaporates off, and so on. What's responsible for the increase in runoff? Two of the biggest culprits are new development and logging, both on the shoreline and in the thousands of acres upslope in the watershed. A lot of development starts with logging, because logging comes with more lenient regulations about carving roads into the forest. These marginally engineered roads leave highly erosive soils raw and exposed, just waiting for even light rains to move those soils to the lake. And studies show that even when doing partial logging instead of clear cutting, and even when using so-called best management practices to prevent runoff, the runoff after partial logging is substantially higher than from an adjacent, identical lot left unlogged.
There is increased runoff and sediment produced from any logging. It doesn't matter if it's a clear cut or a partial cut. Logging produces increased water flows and sediment into the streams.
And because that runoff is rich in phosphorus, the nutrient that feeds algae and lakeweeds, here's what a popular fishing spot near Sportsman's Access looks like now.
I never really thought I would ever see this lake deteriorate this much.
Really?
Because it was such a cold, clear lake, you know, to start with. But you know, just like those people next door to the cabin, they can't control stormwater on that little lot with that big house. You know, and if you went to any other lake, they would never get a building permit. The county will give them one.
So it isn't entirely that developers aren't following the rules. In fact, many are. But the rules aren't stringently enforced, and even if they were, experts say those rules aren't protecting the environment enough. And there are also developers who dodge the rules, who are willing, for example, to measure the runoff on an environmentally sensitive piece of land during the dry time of year and neglect to mention what watchful citizens know all too well, that during the spring, the volume of water running off that land is perhaps 200 times higher than they've reported. With the county understaffed and under-budgeted, they're likely to get away with it, causing more and more sediment to contaminate the lake that belongs to everybody. And if they don't get away with it, well, it costs less to pay penalties than to do things right in the first place.
I can't get into the moral of it. My deal in life, my role, my responsibility is to be the voice of objectivity. So I have to be the voice of rationality. We look at it from a technical, scientific, from a cost benefit, from all those aspects, but moral is not within my job description.
And here's something a lot of people are afraid to bring up, because they know how some of you love your personal watercraft and your big, powerful motorboats. But studies show that the turbulence these machines cause, even when they're outside the no-wake zone, kicks up stuff that's already settled to the lake bottom. as far down as 30 or 40 feet.
This is one form of recycling we really would not want to do. We're starting a whole new problem for Hayden Lake.
And of course the effects of that turbulence are seen most profoundly in areas where the water is shallower and where a lot of adults choose to, or youngsters are encouraged to, engage in fast or extreme motorsports.
We've lived on Hayden Lake since 1981, and we've always gotten our drinking water directly from Hayden Lake.
We used to change our water filter once a year. Now we have to change it every other month.
So tell me, how do you know when it's time to change the filter?
When it smells.
The water out of the faucet?
The water out of the faucet or the water out of the shower. You know it's time to change the filter.
The propeller action is stirring this up, and we believe that that phosphorus is getting kicked around like it never has in past years.
You look in the water and it's just pea green, and that's due to the number of algae plants that are there.
It's June, and I'm standing on the dock at Honeysuckle Beach. One of the first things I'm noticing is the color of the water. Look out across the surface, and it looks pretty normal. Look straight down. Ooh, it's rather shocking. As already mentioned, it's pea green, literally pea green. Take a dip to cool off on this hot summer day, and you're likely to develop a case of swimmer's itch. Swimmer's itch is due to parasites that penetrate and live in your skin for about 5 to 7 days. They're carried by critters that live in the weeds that grow in the lake. So the more pollution, the more weeds, and the uglier and itchier your rash. Swimmer's itch is a sort of canary in the coal mine, letting you know that the lake's water quality is deteriorating. And there are other ramifications too.
Hayden Lake was historically a self-sustaining cutthroat trout fishery. With the deterioration of the watershed, the fishery can't support itself without large-scale trout stocking.
Cutthroat are a species of trout that needs clean, clear, cold water. And if these attributes aren't there, they start to die out.
We're in a small basin called Stump Creek that flows into Hayden Creek, that then flows into Hayden Lake. High school kids, what we call the mud boggers, turned this into a mud bogging play area, which impacted the fishery resources, impacted the water quality of Stump Creek, Hayden Creek, and potentially Hayden Lake.
Cutthroat in this system are called adfluvial fish, where they are raised in a stream and then moved to the lake as adults.
And they'll live in this stream for about a year or two until they're maybe 4 to 6 inches long, and then grow in the lake up to a large, and we've seen some record trout being caught in Hayden Lake for the public who love to fish, me being one of them.
So the streams that surround Hayden Lake are very important to the continuation of a trout fishery within the lake.
But a project like this, to haul all these logs in, get everything closed up, use large machine, cost the government about $10,000. It's not cheap to repair our watersheds. It's cheaper to keep them in good, high quality state and let Mother Nature maintain them for us. She works fairly cheaply.
It's costing a heck of a lot more than that for Forest Service employees to continue policing areas like this one, and for Idaho Fish and Game to add the nearly 1 million West Slope cutthroat trout they've put into the Hayden Lake system over the past several years. They've had to, because as you may recall,
with the deterioration of the watershed, the trout fishery in Hayden Lake can't support itself without large-scale stocking.
One of our jobs was we monitored cutthroat reds in Hayden Creek, and there was lots of them. I mean, you just drive up these fork of Hayden Creek and you would see reds everywhere, and you don't see that now.
In addition to logging in the watershed and development in the watershed, both of which have already done terrible damage to the streams, A big problem is when people who are lucky enough to have one of the fishery streams running near or through their land take water from it. The stream's base flow declines, and it declines the most significantly during the time of year when it's hot and dry, when everybody's demand for water is the highest, and when the flow in the streams is the lowest. The fish simply won't survive it.
Our streams are connected to our groundwater. In August, we'll get our maximum water temperatures, and the fish can be stressed. They'll die. Generally, as water moves downstream, it tends to warm up. And a stream like Stump Creek, and especially if the headwaters are being groundwater fed, fish will move out of Hayden Creek into Stump Creek when the water temperatures in Hayden get too high, and use this as what we call thermal refugia.
Thermal refugia, as in taking refuge in the life-saving coolness of the headwaters. That is, as long as nobody has taken that water for their new ranchette or for a subdivision. So as you've heard, among people whose opinions command respect, there's pretty impressive agreement that Hayden Lake is in deep trouble, and that Hayden Lake, with its dramatic and colorful history and great big question mark of a future, is worth protecting.
They all said the water was our salvation, the lake. It meant everything to them.
Even if you don't live on Hayden Lake, even if you rarely visit her, even if you don't feel a moral obligation to her as a valued natural resource, there's bound to be at least one thing about her declining health that affects you, whether it's because you drink water that comes from the lake or the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer, or you love watching your kids or grandkids play without swallowing pollutants or without getting swimmer's itch or getting pollutants in their eyes, or you like to fish, or you enjoy having a place to play with your toys, or your business profits from the lake's contribution to the local economy, or the lake is just one way you decompress. The bottom line is, what happens to Hayden Lake matters, and it'd be great if we could shorten our learning curve by learning from what has happened to other lakes, like Lake Mendota, near Madison, Wisconsin, with its Eurasian water milfoil troubles and its pea-green water. Back in 2002, experts estimated that the problem had already cost the city about $50 million just in lost recreation revenue and lost property values. And researchers have this sobering prediction about Lake Mendota. Quote, even if phosphorus pollution halted immediately, almost 3 centuries would need to pass before the watershed would have the same healthy readings it did in the 1970s. That's because in addition to the phosphorus that enters the lake from the watershed, which is called external loading, eventually internal loading comes into play. That's from kicking up accumulated phosphorus from the lake bottom, and from those abundant lake weeds that grow because of the excess phosphorus. When those weeds die every winter and decompose in the water, phosphorus literally oozes out of them. Does the fact that Hayden Lake is in deep trouble mean it's doomed? One thing in our favor is that we could get busy as a community before Hayden Lake goes as far down the tubes as Lake Mendota has. But Hayden Lake is half the size of Lake Mendota, and yet it has twice as much shoreline, which means the potential for many more residences crowded around it than Lake Mendota has to endure. And unlike Lake Mendota, Hayden Lake has a steep and highly erodible watershed and no river outlet.
What we see in Hayden Lake is the algae development from a few bays moving to larger bays and out into the main lake body.
Water quality issues in Hayden Lake directly impact water quality of our aquifer.
Remember, I've said that everything recycles within the lake, so once it gets on this downward trend, unless there's intervention and very costly measures to tie up the nutrients in the sediment, the lake will continue to deteriorate.
It's much, much harder to clean something up than it is to keep it clean to start out with.
In recent years, government scientists have been talking about the TMDL. That stands for Total Maximum Daily Load. It's a calculated figure that looks at the phosphorus burden that's been pouring into a lake over the years and compares that to how much the phosphorus accumulated in the lake has increased as a result. It then assumes that the lake's ability to handle additional phosphorus will remain the same as it's been thus far. Based on that assumption, it then comes up with a figure for how much more phosphorus we can get away with every year.
The TMDLs were put there because we're putting too much into the lake year by year. That hasn't changed. We're still loading that much every year. We need to get it to the right phosphorus level. This means that the lake can handle, the natural state of it can handle so much phosphorus. It's when you get over that level, and we've been going over that level, and we've known about it for the last 15 years.
It's true. For decades, stormwater has dumped literally tons of sediment and phosphorus into Hayden Lake, thanks to logging, roads, existing residential sites, and new development. And yet, when a water sample is taken from the lake and tested, the amount of phosphorus in there is too high, but it isn't getting higher at the rate you might expect. Why? Couple of reasons. First, the samples have been taken from the middle of the lake, farthest from where the pollution comes from, where the water is deepest. And studies show that a lake's ecosystem is sort of like your intestinal tract. It can process a certain amount of garbage, digest and metabolize it, the same way you digest and metabolize junk food, without paying obvious health consequences right away. But eventually, you'll have to face the music for your food choices, and when that day comes, it'll feel like it came from out of the blue, but in truth, it was a long time coming.
Water quality systems, like the water quality in Hayden Lake, or in a watershed, in a stream in a watershed, are not linear systems. They're threshold systems. You can add nutrients, and not see anything but minor damage, but all of a sudden, you add a little bit more, and the whole system collapses.
Threshold systems are the straw that broke the camel's back systems. They carry their burdens until they reach their own particular threshold, and then they fall apart. And this is more true of Hayden Lake than most other lakes. Why? You know the answer to that. It has no outlet. In addition to their ability to process a certain amount of nutrients, most lakes also have the ability to dump some of their nutrient burden out through a river outlet. But for Hayden Lake, the phosphorus that goes in isn't going anywhere. And worse, it's getting recycled up into the active water column, where it compounds the problems caused by each year's additional pollution. This is not to say the TMDL system is worthless. It's a good start, but we're already trying to play catch-up, so let's not kid ourselves. We all need to step up to the plate rather than wait for somebody else, i.e. the government, to fix it.
If I was queen for a day, I think some of the biggest concerns that I would see to the water quality is development on steep slopes around the lake. That's number one. And number two, septic systems around the lake. The soils are very clayey on the banks of the lake, and so they don't necessarily function as they need to. And I think that even if they function as they need to at the start, over time, maintenance-wise, etc., they can have a severe negative impact. So I think that that we need to be very careful where and how we allow septic, if we allow septic at all around the lake.
What can be done right now is stormwater needs to be managed, whether it's in the headwaters with logging and road building, or whether it's home development, development of cabins. They have to be cut off and stopped, or it will continue to deteriorate.
When we talk about what we're doing for our own children and grandchildren and look at the science, there should be no doubt about what happens. But we usually get into a room where folks stand up and make speeches about property rights and how their property rights are being threatened by scientific information, that drives me nuts.
Streams in the watershed are the lake's main source of potentially clean water, and they're the only natural source for trout. So we have to change the perception that it's okay to trash them with four-wheel drives, and log around them, and build roads near them, and take water from them, without first making sure the fishery and water quality get first rights. Hayden Lake's streams have taken a beating over the past 30-40 years, and restoring them to pristine health is a necessary part of healing the lake.
We've provided more areas away from our streams for those people to go recreate.
Such as, where would some of those places?
Some of those, just like right up Badger Mountain, we have motorcycle ATV trails. Huckleberry Mountain, we have some motorcycle ATV trails. And I emphasize mountains. We're getting these people up and away from our waterways where we don't want them to play in.
Whether you live right on the shoreline or miles up in the watershed, there are two different sources of phosphorus the lake needs you to take responsibility for: the runoff generated right on your property and the runoff that runs across your property from upslope. Start by taking an honest look. Are there bare spots on your property where the ground is exposed? Not good. Wind and water that either hit that bare ground from above or run across it will stir up and pick up sediment and deliver it downslope. If your land is steep and right on the shoreline of the lake, you're the lake's last hope. Your success will depend almost entirely on picking the right plants and putting them in the right place and maintaining them in the right way to quickly cover those bare spots with long-lasting living greenery. If your piece of land is less steep and if there's more space between you and the lake, you have the luxury of more room to provide flattened or even hollowed out areas that'll put gravity to work for you, such as a settling pond, which slows the water down to a crawl so sediment settles out into the pond and the water that leaves the pond is cleaner than the water that entered it. Or terraces, which turn a steep slope into a series of flat steps, so the water slows down and soaks in on each step. Or grassy swales, which hold the water temporarily, accept its sediment, and then allow it to move along while being combed clean by standing grass. It's not as difficult as it sounds. All you need is good advice, and good advice just happens to be free.
Having a good mix of species, grasses, trees, and shrubs, because they all serve a different function in protecting water quality. Native species are generally the best. They don't require much care because they grow in the area naturally. Sometimes you can take hardwood cuttings from things like willows or dogwoods. Google a native plant society in your area. There's local chapters that have native plant lists.
Native plant lists are great, but I think most of us need more help than that, because on slopes like these, the lake can't afford to wait for us to learn from experience. There's a mixture here of old places, new places, and places under construction, and they've all got quite a bit of bare ground, as you can see. To help you choose the best kinds of plants and decide where and how to plant them so they'll get established quickly, do the most good, and not need a lot of maintenance, I asked Jamie for another option.
There's a good resource in the Panhandle of Idaho. It's called Panhandle Stormwater and Erosion Education Program, which is SEEP. And they do have a website. If you Google Panhandle SEEP, you should find the website online.
And if you want somebody with expertise in watershed erosion control to actually come out to your property and design a plan for you, and maybe even assist you in finding help with the cost,
the best thing to do is talk to your local conservation district representative, and they can help develop a site-specific plan for your vegetation.
In Kootenai County, the contact person would be Mark Addy.
Yeah, I do work for the government, and we're here to help. We're a non-regulatory agency. We're out there doing what the public has hired us to do, and that's to help the resources.
It's a free service. It's a public service through the conservation districts.
We've got biologists, engineers, hydrologists, whatever it takes to get the job done on the ground, we can usually handle it.
The lake can be damaged by other factors too. The good news is, these other factors are easier to fix. Here's an example. If you have a dog, you have dog droppings. Training your dog to go as far from the house as possible protects your shoes, but not the lake. In a watershed, the EPA views dog waste to be, believe it or not, as noxious as oil and toxic chemical spills. In fact, just 2 or 3 days' worth of a neighborhood bay's dog droppings in a watershed can raise the bacteria level in the entire bay high enough to close it to swimming. The fact that Hayden Lake's bays don't get closed because of pet waste doesn't mean they're not affected. It means nobody's checking. In Kootenai County, the solution is simple. Pick up dog waste and put it, with the county's blessings, in the trash. Livestock manure in the watershed is another problem. Manure and urine-soaked stall bedding usually get thrown onto a pile outside, which is actually against federal CAFO laws, because rainwater and snowmelt percolate through the pile, pick up all kinds of nasties, and carry them down slope. Here's a simple solution: a covered, contained compost pile that's aerated from underneath by a blower, so it doesn't have to be turned, ever. It turns ugly, stinky, fly-ridden manure piles into enough money to pay someone to clean stalls every day and pick up manure in the pastures twice a week, and still have money left over. In fact, with this system, every time a horse defecates, that's 25 cents worth of finished, certifiably weed-free garden compost at wholesale prices. At roughly 10 defecations a day per horse, that's more than $900 of untapped income from every animal every year. Got 5 horses? If you're not picking up the manure, you're letting almost $5,000 worth of profits run into the lake. O2compost.com is a Seattle area outfit that can fit you with an aerated static pile compost system that's just the right size, whether you have chickens, sheep, goats, horses, or Herefords. And while we're on this delicate subject, phosphorus from leaky or overwhelmed septic systems is not as abundant as phosphorus from runoff in the watershed, but biologically, it's significantly more potent. And no matter what the TV ads say, septic system additives like Ridex do not eliminate the need to have the sludge pumped out of your septic tank. Have your system inspected this week to find out how often it should be pumped, then get it pumped religiously. And here's another thing that commonly causes even top-notch brand new septic systems to fail.
If you're going to have a bunch of people over for, say, a family reunion, and it might overwhelm your septic system, think about renting a porta potty. They're cheap, easy, they'll come and deliver it, take it away. There's nothing to deal with, and you don't have to worry about overwhelming your septic system and potentially impacting the water quality.
When septic systems fail, it's a disaster for the lake. The pollution will persist and recycle in the lake for decades. To give a great gift to Hayden Lake, call a local septic service company and ask them to put your system on an automatic pumping schedule. And paperclip the phone number for a good porta potty company in your event planner so you won't forget to call them for your next party. Here's a quickie. As we've mentioned, fast powerboats and personal watercraft are accelerating the problem by stirring up sediments on the lake's bottom, especially in the shallows, but in the deeper waters as well. So here's the big controversial question. Can we slow down? Do we have the intellectual capacity to enjoy the incredible natural resources we have here and entertain ourselves without gunning a motor? Here's something I'll bet you didn't know. Forest fires, campfires, brush fires, slash fires, weenie roast fires, all fires in the watershed are major phosphorus polluters of the lake.
It's fun to have weenie roast or s'mores down at the lake, but every gallon of ashes can make a mile square of algae bloom. It could cause a large problem in front of your house. You won't be able to swim. Many times I've come up and talked to people, they are surprised, and I say, after you're done, collect your ashes, put them in a bucket, and take them away to a safe spot where it won't get to the lake.
Okay, with all due respect to Bosch and Whirlpool and Kenmore, when it comes to getting your dishes sparkling clean, the phosphorus in the automatic dishwasher detergent does at least half the heavy lifting. For the sake of the watershed, buy phosphorus-free detergent. It'll work fine if you can just use a little elbow grease on the dishes before you load them. Ask the average Joe what a wetland is, and he'll probably come up with words like swamp and cattails and mud. But wetlands are a watershed's magic eraser. They are where surface water suddenly goes deep, 30, 50, even 200 feet deep, before re-emerging downslope, scrubbed clean. They're like the lake's kidneys. They're vital to its health. And they're not necessarily wet year-round. They can be just boggy areas that reappear every year for only part of the year.
A wetland is a whole eco-environment in itself. There's all sorts of critters in the soil, in the water, and what comes out of a wetland will impact that's downstream.
It takes a particular set of conditions for a wetland to exist. There's the hydrology, which means the water wants to be there naturally. There's the soil type, and then there's specialized plants that grow in wetlands. And they are adapted to that environment, and they work as a filtering sponge in the watershed. They can absorb nutrients, process those before they reach the water. They can attach to contaminants and break those down into harmless compounds. And a lot of people, I think, see them as a nuisance. They see them as just cattails and mud and somewhere that can't be developed, but they really are crucial in protecting water quality.
It's true that the regulations already in place are not being enforced reliably, and in most cases they aren't stiff enough to deter blatant violators, but they're all we have right now. One of the biggest shortfalls is that there are lots of lakes in Kootenai County and only so many investigators. So for the health of Hayden Lake, we need to stand up and be more demanding. Most violators are simply unaware that they're damaging the lake. Some are aware, but they're pretty sure they can get away with it. You don't have to know whether a law has been broken, and you don't have to know whether it's deliberate. If you see something going on in the watershed that could be a problem for the lake, report it.
We need that kind of citizen help because truth of the matter is that the state and federal government are often preoccupied with other problems, and sometimes they only react in response to citizen complaints.
Hayden Lake has some impressive state and federal protections because it's on what's called the Clean Water Act's 303D list. Because of that dubious distinction, if a new project in the watershed is on land that's an acre in size or larger, and it's not done in a way that keeps stormwater runoff from hitting the lake, the penalties can be pretty persuasive.
After a 7-year study, the federal government through EPA in 1994 placed Hayden Lake into a threatened status. What that means is that the federal government enforcing the Clean Water Act can impose fines for violation of the pollution controls in the amount of $32,500 per day for each violation.
The big stumbling block for most people is, who do you call? Is it a county issue? State? Federal? Sometimes even if you call the right agency, the person who answers the phone is human and may not at that particular moment be helpful. Don't be dissuaded. This is important. Here's what to do. For logging or development in 1 acre or more, the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality, I ask for June Bergquist, 769-1422. For logging, mudboggers, or anything else that might affect streams in the watershed, the Coeur d'Alene National Forest River Ranger District, I ask for Ed Leiter, 664-2318. For anything that involves earth moving anywhere in the watershed, the Kootenai County Building and Planning Department, I ask for Scott Clark, 446-1081. To report erosion or to ask for help preventing erosion from sites in the watershed that are already developed, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, I ask for Mark Addy, extension 106. The number is 762-4939. And when you just don't know where to start, the go-to guy is the Hayden Lake Watershed Association's underpaid but dedicated lake manager, Todd Walker.
I'm the guy to call if you have any questions about anything that's going on with Hayden Lake. My telephone number is 771-0525 and call anytime.
That $32,500 daily penalty through the Clean Water Act is rarely enforced, even though apparent violations happen every year. Remember, what goes in Hayden Lake stays in Hayden Lake, so don't wait. If you see earth-moving equipment or construction in the watershed, call DEQ or a Todd Walker to find out if it's being done properly, and then stay with them. Also, unlike the county hearing examiners, our county commissioners don't have to have any scientific or engineering or legal or community planning background at all in order to get elected. But their decisions impact our environment in a huge way. They need scientific and citizen guidance. So it's your job, for the sake of our natural resources, to vote and to support organizations who hold the commissioners' feet to the fire between elections. Help them get the facts, not emotions, not politics, facts.
Some of the elders came here because it was a place where they could be at peace. You know, there's just, I can even feel it now.